It is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Barbara Savage.
Thank you, Shannon and Dean, and certainly the president of the seminary. It's so, I'm really grateful to be in this beautiful sacred space again. And I also want to thank all the folks who made it possible for me to be here. And I certainly want to thank you all for getting up this early in the morning. This occasion gives me an opportunity to re-engage with some of the arguments and ideas that I wrote about in the book for which I was honored here some years ago, which I finished in 2008 in the waning days of the 2008 election. In that book, I'd argued that Black religion's central place in the civil rights movement continues to spawn debates about the relationship between race, religion, and politics, and I think in very unpredictable ways. As I wrote then, there was no better evidence of that, and of that conflict, than the arguments that emerged in 2008 between then Democratic presidential candidate Barack Obama and his longtime pastor, the Reverend Grawemeyer Award of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. The public clash between the two men, media manipulations aside, the clash demonstrated how the tensions between Black religion and Black politics had actually been exacerbated in the 4 decades since the civil rights movement had ended. The specific differences between Obama and Wright were at once political and theological. So I want to spend some time this morning recapturing some of that tension through that particular example, but I also want to talk about the evolution of President Obama's ideas on race, religion, faith, and community since his election. And then I want to conclude with a brief discussion of the role of ideas about race, religion, faith, and community in the present moment, one that's marked by a resurgence of a new Black activism and a new generation of young activists, exemplified to me by the Black Lives Matter movement. But I want to go back, and I cannot resist doing a history lesson, of course. And I want to just say that in 1969, James Foreman, who was both the executive director of SNCC and a former officer of the Black Panther Party, interrupted a Sunday morning service at Riverside Church in New York City to issue a Black manifesto demanding that American Christian churches and Jewish synagogues provide $500 million in reparations to Black communities to make amends for their complicity in past wrongs against Black people. Now, his demands elicited 2 very surprising responses. The first was that a number of prominent white clergymen and predominantly white religious organizations actually endorsed these demands, the demands in Foreman's manifesto, pledging substantial sums of money to organizations working to alleviate Black poverty and suffering. And these actions were taken by the leaders despite the fact that the white lay response to the idea of reparations for past complicity was almost uniformly negative, with over 90% rejecting the idea. I think the second surprise is that Foreman had to be persuaded at the last minute to focus his demands only on white people, abandoning his original intent of also targeting Black churches, whom he implicated as well in the sins of Western Christianity. Despite that concession, a diverse group of Black religious and political leaders vehemently opposed Foreman's tactics and his demands on white Christians and Jews. Foreman's ideas, which were inflected with Marxism and an anti-colonialist critique, remind us that debates about religion and politics in the immediate post-civil rights era engaged much more explicitly with Black nationalism, Black radicalism, and Black internationalism, subjects always present, but never as publicly prominent as in that period. In the same year that Foreman issued his manifesto, the black theologian James Cohen, who many of you will be familiar with, of course, began articulating a distinctive black theology. Cohen's work articulated a long-standing ethos of liberation in black religious thought, expressed across many centuries through spirituals and sermons and in the writings of a long line of black religious intellectuals. Cohen's work had the practical political intent of helping black religious institutions maintain their political vitality in the age of black power, when many of them were under attack. In the same period, the ethicist Gaylord Wilmore, writing in 1973, made claim for the existence of a radical tradition in black Christianity. Building on those ideas and a progressive approach to Marxism, in 1982, Cornel West argued for a prophetic black Christianity with revolutionary potential. And later in that decade, black women theologians, among them Dolores Williams, Katie Cannon, and Emily Towns, would challenge and supplement these works by constructing a womanist theology that veered away from the masculinist caste that permeated so much thought not only about God, but about gender and power relations within churches. So in these ways, we see that black theologians and philosophers in the decades right after the civil rights movement ended, recast Christianity in ways that maintained its pertinence to the continued political struggles facing black communities and black men and women. The prominent place of religion within the civil rights movement also prompted social scientists to re-enter old debates about the relationship between charismatic leadership and organized political activism, and about the kind of institutional apparatus needed for social movements to emerge and succeed. The necessity for rethinking the long-standing paradigms was also demonstrated in the work of historians working in the immediate post-civil rights era. So more importantly, we see works on slavery and enslaved people adopting an emancipatory interpretation of black religion, the most prominent examples being Albert Rabateau's slave religion. So this renewed interest in black religion also generated a plethora of works by historians on the various black religious denominations, but it wouldn't be until the 1990s that Evelyn Higginbotham's path-breaking work on the central role of black women in the Black Baptist Church led the way for other works on religion, race, and gender. I think what's interesting is that this burgeoning historical literature about the civil rights movement itself, while it certainly acknowledges the obvious presence of religion and religious culture and religiously motivated people, that literature was very slow to interrogate the broader historical and political implications of religion's presence, often simply accepting religion as a natural part of the movement and as a natural part of black lives and black communities. And I think in many cases, studies also sought to diminish religion's importance in favor of other sites and motivations of mobilizations at the grassroots and national levels. So I think one of the economic consequences of the civil rights movement's successes was the creation of this expanded black middle class that now supports large, financially prosperous megachurches in major urban and metropolitan centers. As varied as African American religion itself, many of these churches harness resources sufficient to enact effective political and community interventions. And that development, also again a product of the civil rights movement, created its own set of controversies, as some of these churches have been subject to criticisms about the politically conservative policies and religious allies that some of them cultivate, or about their dedication to a gospel of individual rather than communal prosperity. These criticisms came at a time when many still expect black religion and religious institutions to deliver poor black communities out of the wilderness created by centuries of economic, political, and social isolation. This, in turn, is part of a larger contest over whether responsibility for ending the dire economic consequences of persistent racial injustice rest within Black community institutions alone or within the broader American Commonwealth, or in tandem. Among the many Black megachurches where the answer to that question has been a resounding both is Chicago's Trinity United Church of Christ, the institution brought to public notoriety in the controversy surrounding its prominent longtime pastor, the Reverend Wright, and one of its parishioners, Obama. The church and Wright's leadership of it had first attracted Obama's attention when he was a young community organizer, precisely because of its social activism, its service to the urban poor, and the unemployed. It was Wright's long-standing espousal of a brand of Black liberationist theology that, when taken out of its private, racialized, religious context through the endless looping of those videos, if you recall, that's when the work of that church and his ideas drew fears and scorn from a larger public. Now, for Obama, Trinity had been one more stop in his search for community, for racial identity, for an anchoring place, and for the kind of redemptive political work he associated with the civil rights movement. As a child in Hawaii, his mother had offered him what he remembered as the grainy black and white footage of the civil rights movement. He says those images to him were of a county jail bursting with children, their hands clasped together, singing freedom songs. Such images became a form of prayer for me, he writes, bolstering my spirits, channeling my emotions in a way that words never could. So in these ways, his very earliest ideas about the movement revolved around moments of collective redemption, symbolized for him when people of different colors and faiths seemed to converge, he wrote, the crowd in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the Freedom Rides, those at the lunch counters. Much later, when he was a college student here in New York City at Columbia, Obama's attendance at a speech by the SNCC veteran Kwame Ture unnerved him, leading him later to write that Ture's eyes glowed inward as he spoke, the eyes of a madman or a saint, and that seeing him was like a bad dream, an embodiment of the way, in Obama's view, that the movement had died years ago, shattered into 1,000 fragments. So it was Obama's deeply personal search for a sense of wholeness that did not rest on racial purity or on the bloodlines we inherited, as he described it. These are the things that drove him, I think ironically, to the Black religious world of Trinity and the Reverend Wright. It was there that Obama heard stories of Black trials and triumphs, narratives that to him seemed at once unique and universal. Those stories he recounted in his 1995 memoir and repeated in his Philadelphia speech on race and religion in 2008, those stories of survival and freedom and hope became our story, my story. The blood that had spilled was our blood, the tears our tears, until this Black church on this bright day seemed once more a vessel carrying the story of a people into future generations and to a larger world. So to be asked to reject that experience, as his political critics demanded during that campaign, was to him to reject the religious inspiration and the Black community that he had so fervently sought. For it was there in Trinity's pews and under the sounds of Wright's preaching that Obama found his way out of aloneness through a fresh faith in other people and a religious spirit that, he wrote, carried within it, nascent, incomplete, the possibility of moving beyond our narrow dreams. Among the understandings that Obama attributed to that church was the idea That religious commitment, he said, did not require me to suspend critical thinking or to disengage from the battle for economic and social justice or otherwise retreat from the world. For him, the revelations at Trinity came as a choice and not as an epiphany, just as he openly confessed in his writings that kneeling between that cross on the south side of Chicago, I feel God's Spirit beckoning me. I submitted myself to his will and dedicated myself to discovering his truth. So Obama's ideas about race, religion, and politics are couched as much of what he believes in a sense of history, memory, and generational obligations. Repeatedly, he has invoked the stories of Moses and Joshua, reminding his listeners and his readers, as had Martin Luther King Jr., that while Moses led his people to the promised land, it was Joshua and a sea of unified voices that completed the mission. Dubbing himself and his followers as members of the Joshua generation, Obama urged them to join together to shout down the walls of Jericho in a unified and racially diverse campaign that reclaims the yet unfulfilled promises of the civil rights movement and its generation. And it is that appeal that has resonated so profoundly with those who made that history, those who remember it, and those who are seared by the same grainy black and white images that Obama's mother showed him and that I, nearly a decade older than he, remember from my own childhood. Closer to the time when he actively aspired to national political office, Obama repeatedly presented his own religious and political motivations as mutually reinforcing. Speaking in 2005 at an event honoring John Lewis, Obama commended the courage of the civil rights generation for inspiring him to public service work, telling the crowd that, quote, "We have songs left to sing and bridges left to cross." Later explaining, when he announced his campaign for the presidency, that it is time for our generation to answer that call. In a 2008 commemoration of King's birthday, Obama spoke as King had about the need for diversity and unity. In this struggle for peace and justice, he said, we cannot walk alone. In the struggle for opportunity and equality, we cannot walk alone. In the struggle to heal this nation and repair the world, we cannot walk alone. So I ask you to walk with me and march with me and join your voice with mine. And together we will sing the song that tears down the walls that divide us and lift up an America that is truly indivisible with liberty and justice for all. So in all of these ways, we see that Obama's 21st century ideas about race and religion and politics and community remain firmly within the ideological, religious, and political traditions of many Black men and women of the 20th century: Carter G. Woodson, W.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, Nannie Burroughs, and Benjamin Mays, who preceded not only him, but King as well. Those ideas about religious faith and community as a unifying and redemptive political force are as old as the Hebrew Scriptures and as fresh as the writings and speeches of 20th century scholars and religious intellectuals before and during the Civil Rights era. Press reports have repeatedly called Obama post-Black and post-civil rights, but his political and religious orientation might better be termed neo-Black and neo-civil rights. Like the genre of music dubbed neo-soul, he enlivened and replicated the politics of the civil rights past he revered, yet he also strove to transcend it with modern technologies. Yet he could never move beyond race or transcend it, despite his eloquent employ of his biracialism and his transnational heritage. He wanted to, but those who opposed him fought against that and against him. This became clear when Obama's opponents sought to use his affiliation with right and African American religion to, in effect, blacken him and to render him as radical, as untrustworthy, as other, as alien, and eventually as non-Christian. That hasn't ended, by the way. In his initial claim that to reject Wright and to reject Trinity Church was to reject the Black community, Obama himself relied on the trope that the Black church stands in for all that is honorable and good and acceptable about Black life. What Obama also knew, however, was that he could not afford to let the controversy separate him from the loyal Black electorate on which his campaign depended. Obama's political career also represents another facet of the gains from the civil rights movement, the emergence of larger numbers of Black elected officials. That development brings its own contradictions and conflicts over who best represents Black communities and advances their interests. Just as significantly, the overwhelming and essential support that Obama received from African American voters masked their own diversity, and it's a diversity that transcends religion, race, gender, and economic status. One constant, however, is that Black women who constitute a majority of the Black electorate and the majority of Black congregations remain the largely unseen force in both of these arenas. Those were the people that Obama could not afford to offend in his initial public discussions of Wright and Black religion. Yes, Black preachers mattered to him, but it was the women in the pews who would carry him forward, and he knew that. So Obama succeeded, at least temporarily, by employing a politics of Black religion that deflected the politics of race that threatened his presidential aspirations. Later, when he did indeed renounce and reject Wright, he relegated Wright, his religious mentor, to a bygone era marked by racial division and pain. So Obama erected a generational divide between them, but that disavowal disregarded the longer historical narrative from which Wright and Trinity UCC had emerged. It was somewhat disingenuous. The preacher, Grawemeyer Wright, of course, embodies many of the attributes of the highly educated, politically engaged clerical figure demanded by earlier and current generations of Black reformers. He led a service-oriented church that was politically engaged and emotional, and yet emotional in worship style. In fact, those were the aspects of the church and its pastor that had appealed to Obama. Wright's sense of a prophetic obligation also included a harsh critique of U.S. domestic and foreign policies that were inconsistent with Obama's electoral pursuits that rested on his faith in a universalist American democracy. So Wright's commitments to Black cultural nationalism and anti-militarism were antithetical to the patriotic political project that Obama had worked so hard to construct for himself as he pursued the ultimate American dream, growing up to be the president. In a speech to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., Wright came to his own defense, explaining his sense of call and the mission of his church. Wright's largely ignored address, which was overshadowed by a very contentious encounter with the media which followed, but that address by Wright was a masterful account of Black religious history stretching back to the 1600s, to slavery, and to Africa. In the same way that Obama had portrayed the Black community and the Black church as one, Wright equated the attacks on him with an attack on the Black church. They both were guilty of collapsing the diversity and distinctiveness among Black churches for the sake of political argument, but Wright also cast his defense of the Black church as part and parcel of a defense of the religion of Barbara Jordan, of Fannie Lou Hamer, and of his grandmother. In his historical recapitulation, Wright stood firmly with those who earlier in the 20th century had argued for the existence of African cultural retentions in Black religions, but he took it a step further by emphasizing the continued cultural exchanges between the religious practices of Black people in the United States and those in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in South America. He recounted the history of the evolution of Black and white churches in the United States, emphasizing that Black independent churches were formed in the 1700s in reaction against white parishioners' attempts to segregate or to discriminate against Black members. So Wright was very careful to stress that those early Black churches were themselves welcoming to members regardless of race, and continued to do so, just as did his church Trinity, which included whites, Hispanics, and Black people from the Caribbean, South America, and Africa. In that way, he took on the familiar rhetorical question that Obama and others before him, including King and Mays, had raised. And the question is, why is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning still the most segregated hour in America? Wright answered it by relieving Black churches of the responsibility for that and shifted blame instead to white Christians and white churches. At the same time, Wright wanted to pay credit to the United Church of Christ, the larger denomination, the predominantly white denomination with which his church is affiliated. That denomination, of course, has its own history, which stretches back to colonial-era congregational churches in New England. As he explained, those white churches came to the moral defense and paid for the legal defense of the Mende people aboard the slave ship Amistad, fought against slavery, played an active role in the Underground Railroad, and set up over 500 schools for Africans who were freed from slavery in 1865. The denomination's commitments to ending racial justices endure, he stressed, citing its most recent leadership at the time in the fight against apartheid in South Africa and racism in the U.S. And I should also say, what he doesn't say is that the UCC, or as it was called then, the congregational churches after the Civil War, also set up a number of small Black churches throughout the South, and I was raised in one of them in Southern Virginia that was established in 1874 by missionaries from the congregational churches. So it was that model of political engagement that made the fit between this predominantly white liberal denomination and Wright's church compatible. Whatever the differences between Obama and Wright, they both celebrated the work that Trinity was doing in Chicago to try to improve the lives of the impoverished and the disadvantaged. The church itself was, of course, relatively new. It was, in fact, a post-civil rights institution. It was founded in 1961 and began to be led by Wright in 1972. And the work that he was doing during the time basically cobbled together the economic gains of a Black middle class in Chicago and committed them to the homeless and the needy, to building and operating housing complexes for the elderly, providing child care programs, and trying to help the unemployment. It sent its graduating seniors to college, it sent students to seminary, it supported both the United Negro College Fund and historically Black colleges that were affiliated with the denomination. So it pioneered a ministry to youth, and like its larger denomination, it welcomed, unlike most religious traditions, lesbians and gay men as members. And during a time when many Black congregations recoiled from the AIDS crisis, Trinity began providing services and ministries for those with AIDS and HIV. So Wright wanted that story told. That's the story he wanted us to understand in his defense of the Black church. And because his most significant, I think, yet most subtle historical dispute was with those who tried to explain him, his ministry, and his church's work as a mere manifestation of Black theology. And even though he was both a friend and a supporter of James Cohen, he rejected that. and really wanted to link his church's work back to a longer biblical and historical tradition of prophetic ministry and theology that he saw stretching back to the prophet Isaiah. So in his understanding of that tradition, one not only helps the poor and the less able, but one also works to change oppressive prevailing social orders by criticizing those who rule and hold power, whether it's in the state, in the economy, or in the military. Wright saw himself and his ministry as part of God's desire, he said, for a radical change in a social order that has gone sour. When Wright said that he was a preacher and Obama was a politician, it was widely interpreted as an attack on Obama. And I want to say that in fairness, Wright was pointing to the obvious and I think the very different ways that these two men had chosen to live out their common religious beliefs and a sense of call. Obama believed that with his leadership, he could advance the perfectibility of American democracy, resting on his faith in the Constitution and the band of patriots who had drafted it. Wright believed himself to be no less a patriot. He'd served honorably as a Marine, but he saw himself primarily as a prophetic minister. He explained that his church took a stand against apartheid when the government of our country was supporting the racist regime of the African government in South America, and many other examples. So in these ways, we have a preacher and a politician who are absolutely destined for conflict, even when both are African American Christians, and I think especially when one of them aspires to and then eventually assumes control of the reins of the national state and its military power. I do what pastors do, Wright said, and referring to Obama, he does what politicians do. So the broader issue here in this controversy, and the reason I wanted to spend so much time kind of bringing that back to our memory, is that the kind of simple dichotomies that drive most of our discussions about race and religion and politics and community, I think still have so much traction because African American religion itself remains a subject of much mystery, much misunderstanding, and much manipulation, and especially by an unknowing mass media, which often invents fights and controversies and distorts and destroys reputations in the process. So it's been very interesting, having thought about that conflict, to also kind of follow the evolution of President Obama's ideas about race, religion, and faith during the course of his time in office. It's easy to find evidence of his thinking on those matters. It's in his 2 inaugural addresses. It's in his speeches at the annual prayer breakfast. But most tellingly, it's in the many eulogies that he has had to deliver since he's been in office. And I say that now as a person of a certain age, where even I've been asked to speak at memorial services for friends and colleagues, some older and some younger than I am. But there's nothing like trying to find the right words to console and to consider another's life and death, to bring us face to face with the very questions we consider here today about faith, community, and on many occasions for him, race and politics. I know pastors face this all the time, but it's particularly interesting to see someone like Obama, who's not a pastor, also have to take on that work. When at the annual prayer breakfast in Washington, where he always speaks, I've been able to see his most open remarks on his own faith and his beliefs as they have changed over time. And just want to point to a couple of recurring themes in what he says there. We see very plainly his commitment to ecumenicalism. It's very strong and very clear, as is his faith in the shared values and ethical lives of those who do not embrace any religion or who do not believe in God. His own prayer life, he says, rests on repeated pleas for the ability, he says, to help those who are struggling and to serve the least among us. He prays and asks for humility, to accept the limits of his own understanding. He prays to walk closer with God and to make that walk his first and most important task. For him, faith is always entangled with doubt, but his faith has deepened during his presidency, which he sees as a way for him to live out his faith in service to others. But it is, in fact, the recognition of the limits of his power, the power of the person thought to be the most powerful leader in the world. It's the limit of his powers that most remind him of his humility. He often cites scriptures to that effect, from Romans, "Do not claim to be wiser than you are," or from Matthew, "For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." He has said that, quote, "No one knows the full and encompassing mind of God." And I imagine that the limitation of his own powers to effect the changes, both here at home and abroad, that he's promised and not been able to fulfill, brings him face to face every day with not only his own humility, but with a search for faith in a larger, unseen plan. What is most compelling about his appearances at the prayer breakfast is the ways in which he repeatedly speaks of his own journey into faith, into being a follower of Jesus Christ, as the key to everything that has happened in his life since. He recounts on several occasions that he was not raised in a religious home, that his mother was a skeptic, that his parents were lapsed Christians, but that he was raised with values that he would later come to identify with the basis of many of the world religions. Take care of one another, treat other people the way you want to be treated, fair play, honesty, integrity. But it wasn't until he wandered into Black churches as part of his work as a Chicago community organizer that he saw faith in action and Black religious people engaged in the mission of service, love, and politics. And it was then that he says that he, quote, first heard God's Spirit calling him into a higher purpose, to meet life's most sacred responsibility, which was to sacrifice something of ourselves for a person in need. Of this particular revelation, he says, "I'm grateful not only because I was broke and the church fed me, but because it led to everything else." And he lists that it led him to Jesus, that it led him to Michelle, then to his own 2 daughters, and to a deeper sense of his own mission of public service. He believes that his faith to answer the call of Jesus to follow me brought him into a community of faith and believers committed to political activism. What he doesn't say is that it also brought him into community with politically motivated, religious Black people in ways that his time in Hawaii, his time at Pomona, his time at Columbia University, and even his time at Harvard Law School could never do. His Christianity, his embrace of a racial identification as Black, and his growing commitment to engage in politics are all intertwined for him. He is a living testament to and an embodiment of the conjoined nature of Black religion, faith, community. In both of his inaugural addresses, if one looks there for his ideas about religion, we see him speaking boldly of our racist past, of the sacrifice borne by our ancestors, and he's referred to our enslaved ancestors as those who have shed blood drawn by the lash, also reminding us the nation could not afford to survive half slave and half free. So this call of history and justice and his own Christianity also led to his outspoken embrace of gay, lesbian, and transsexual people, and of marriage equality in his policies, in his inaugural, and even in his State of the Union addresses. And this is an often overlooked aspect of his work toward community and healing, including within African American communities, which, as many of you know, are also home to lesbians and gay men, bisexuals, and transgender people. And know his support of those communities did not cost him support of African American communities. So we see here the maturation both of his faith and of his willingness, I think, to also speak more forcefully about racism in history and in the contemporary. And I think the two are related, and I think that was best illustrated in the eulogy he gave last June in South Carolina of the Reverend Clemente Pinckney. To speak in the presence of so much pain and loss in Charleston, in that church, grieving many losses, and over the body of a man but 41 years old, but who also had 2 young daughters, seemed to really touch and move him deeply. He spoke of the dual status Reverend Pinckney held as being both a pastor and a public servant, but saw that as a distinction historically common among Black people and a role dedicated to working all week long, and not just on Sundays, but all week long for a just society. But it was the theme of grace that drove his eulogy, and not because he chose to sing it out loud in the end, but because he invoked it to say that this country has been blessed by grace, but had yet to prove itself worthy of the gift, in large part because of racial injustices past and present. Perhaps most poignantly, he commended the taking down of the Confederate flag as an expression of God's grace and a recognition that the Civil War was fought over slavery, which was wrong, and that the war had defeated the Confederacy. Now, this is simply a pointed statement of fact, but that fact still needs to be said out loud in the 21st century. But rarely is it said, and certainly not by most politicians, and certainly not by most presidents. So, dismissing the need for any more conversations about race, he said, "We have talked enough." He outlined a litany of wrongs in need of remedy. By making the moral choice to change, he said, we can express God's grace. At the exact same time that our attention was focused on the grief and loss in South Carolina, the Black Lives Matter movement was in Detroit, holding its first national retreat. The movement by that name, as most of you know, was born in reaction to the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his killer in 2013. That moment brought together a new, younger generation, which was already hard at work in local communities, but now joined together in a new national network of locally based grassroots justice groups. The 3 Black queer women, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, who launched the hashtag Black Lives Matter, were each already involved in grassroots organizing in their own communities, as were many of those who joined them. Patrisse Cullors was working in LA on school-to-prison pipeline issues, having been shaken by her own brother's experience at the hands of the state and by the killing of Oscar Grant in 2010 by transit police in Oakland. Opal Tometi was working on immigration issues affecting people of African descent, and Alicia Garza was working on domestic worker rights, policies affecting Black youth, and policing issues in San Francisco. And what has evolved, or what I see, is a movement of radical inclusion, but that is spirit-filled with rituals and talk of healing and wholeness and spiritual work, but outside the confines of organized religion. Although increasingly I am learning and seeing that many of those who are involved in this movement come from very religious backgrounds, but many also have been rejected by the religions in which they have been raised. And so many have created and affiliated with other spiritual and spirit-led people who embrace inclusion, activism, community, faith, and hope in their work together in poor and working class communities, and they reject heteronormative patterns of male or cisgender leadership. Someone has referred to Black Lives Matter as both a spirit and a movement. And when I've been in the presence of some of those affiliated with this movement, including last night, it's the strength of the spirit that is so reminiscent of the 1960s to me. Yes, there are pastors and religious lay people supporting the movement, and Leslie Callahan is one of them. But I mean here the actual ethos and energy of the people within the movement. People, when I talked about the civil rights movement, I often refer to it as a religious rebellion. And I feel some of that here again. I see in them and I feel from them a deep spirituality. I can't ascribe a theology to it, nor can I put it in a category or a particular faith tradition, but it is there and it is powerful. Many of their ideas, of these young activists about policies and politics were formed in reaction to organized religion's failures and rejections of who they are and what they believe, but an underlying connection to a larger sense of call, a larger sense of healing and outreach, and yes, a larger sense of outrage over injustice seems to undergird that spirit. And for them, it's all bound up together. Their ideas about race, about community, about faith, their work and their faith ultimately in humanity and in us, it is all there, and they use that language. They look back for inspiration and guidance neither to Wright or to Obama, but to the works and words of Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, two women who were outside of broader politics and outside of the pulpit, but who were both radically inclusive, spirit-led tellers of the truth. They see their movement as a liberation movement. And so I thought about how a liberation movement differs from a freedom movement, which is a term that's often used to describe the long struggle against racial injustice. And that in turn got me to think about how one can be emancipated but not free, and how one can be free but not liberated. So they're calling for liberation. And so I was reminded of the old Negro spiritual, oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. So this is a movement for liberation. Like others in the past, it releases us from the control of traditions, of habits of mind, and yes, of state practices and policies, of hierarchies of power all around us, and it aims to liberate us so that we might also experience freedom here before we take to our graves. And I pray that the president, who traces his roots and his route to power from organizing traditions of Black churches in Chicago, who found faith and community and love and a life's calling, in fact, family, that President Obama, yes, a politician, but on occasion also called to be a pastor to the nation, and a nation that's unhealed of its racist past, that the people who are in the Black Lives Matter movement, I hope, remind him of his younger self, and that he might see himself in them and see them in himself, and that might remind him to recall Paul as he reminded the Romans that all who are led by the Spirit, this is my handwriting, I'm not moved by my own prose, it's more that I cannot read my handwriting, that all who are, this early morning inspiration as well, that all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God, for we did not receive a spirit of slavery and fall back into fear, but we received a spirit of adoption, that we bear witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and that in all things we are more than conquerors through the God who loves us. And so I'm grateful to the Black Lives Matter movement for their faith in us and in one another, for its energy and its engagement, and for adding complexity to our understanding of Black spirituality and Black politics, and for challenging all of us, as was said last night, to think more deeply about what it means to liberate one another so that we might all be free. Amen.